looking into the bigger picture, featuring the case of Leopold and Loeb and the case of Robert Nixon, with a tie into Richard Wright's native son.
The case of Robert Nixon. Robert Nixon was a 20-year-old serial killer from Tallulah, Louisiana, who started up a criminal record with petty crime. Nixon previously worked as a chauffeur for a successful businessman and even made some money as an extra for 2 Hollywood movies. His petty criminal record took a Jurassic turn when he broke into the Chicago home of Florence Castle on June 29, 1936. Miss Castle became Nixon's first victim. Nixon followed Miss Castle home, climbed through the fire escape into her home with a brick, attempted to rape her, then murdered her. To cover up his crime, he took Miss Castle's lipstick and wrote Black Legion Game on the mirror with a skull and crossbones to trick the police. It's now 1937 in Los Angeles, California. Robert Nixon and his friend Howard Jones Green finished shooting pool, stopped by the theater, then decided to search for somewhere to rob. They came across the Astoria apartments and made their way into an apartment. On the night of April 4, 1937, the murder of Miss Edna Warden and her 12-year-old daughter Marguerite Warden had been discovered in their apartments by their landlord. The mother and daughter were beaten to death and raped by an unknown assailant. Fingerprints and a brickbat were left behind by this assailant. The murder was then linked by police to a murder a month prior to the Wardens of a young mother, Rose Valdez, who was found raped and murdered in the next room over to her newborn baby. The young mother, like the Wardens, was slain by a brick. The search for the perpetrator began as police linked multiple other assaults to the murders. Previously, the skull of Elizabeth Rees was fractured by an African-American man also using a brick. And on March 28th, Zoe Damrell was brutally attacked by an African-American man also yielding a brick. The description of Damrell's assaulter was matched to the description of the African-American man lurking around the Valdez home just before her murder. Multiple other assaults were made by Nixon in Los Angeles. He then migrated back to Chicago, assaulted a few more women, and raped and murdered Miss Anna Kuchta on August 29th with another brick. Nixon got away with these crimes until the murder of a Chicago fireman's wife, Florence Johnson, on May 27, 1938. Nixon and his accomplice Earl Hicks attempted to rape Miss Johnson, then murdered her with a brick and fled. However, Nixon had been found by police just a few blocks down, covered in blood. He was taken in by Chicago police and was found to be the matched assailant of the Wardens, Florence Castle, and Anna Kuchta by fingerprint. Nixon revealed to police where Hicks was at. Hicks was taken in, and the two later gave their confessions. Hicks insisted that he had not been the one to murder Miss Johnson, but Nixon. Although Hicks did admit to being present at the murder, police believed him. 2 days later, Nixon and Hicks were temporarily released from jail to reenact the murder of Florence Johnson. Nixon later confessed to the murders of Miss Kuchta and Florence Castle and sexual assaults of Alda Deary, Betty Bryant, and Virginia Austin in Chicago. Due to Nixon's confession, a man named Thomas McCall was discharged from jail, being the accused rapist of Miss Austin. Nixon reenacted the murders of Anna Kuchta, Florence Castle, and the assault and rape of Betty Bryant. Under questioning, Nixon also gave police the location of his Los Angeles accomplice in the Wardens murder and Zoe Damrell attack, Howard Jones Green. The press surrounding the Nixon case repeatedly made offensive remarks on Nixon, calling him racist and offensive names. He was viewed as something of a jungle beast and moron, picking up the name the Brick Moron. Green, Nixon's Los Angeles accomplice in the Warden murder and Zoe Damrell attack, was sentenced to jail October 11, 1938, and was paroled in November 28, 1941, while Hicks, Nixon's Chicago accomplice in the Florence Johnson murder, was given 14 years in jail. The Cook County Criminal Court sentenced Nixon to death by electric chair on October 21st. But before his scheduled execution, Nixon confessed to the murder of the young mother Rose Valdez to clear his consciousness, making this his 6th known murder victim. Nixon was electrocuted on June 16, 1939.
These were children of privilege, of high ideals, who had everything given to them.
They were the last people who had any reason to commit a kidnap.
Nathan F. Leopold Jr. was born November 19, 1904 in Chicago, Illinois. He was very wealthy and intelligent. He graduated from the University of Chicago at age 18 with Phi Beta Kappa honors and had various commending letters from the Harvard all-boys school he attended. He also spoke 15 languages. Richard A. Loeb was also a prodigy, born June 11, 1905 in Chicago, Illinois. He became the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan at only age 17. He moves on to his graduate studies at the University of Chicago. He and Leopold had known each other as children but became closer at university. They then decided to find other interests that set them apart from everyone else. They looked for something that appealed to their sense of self-worth. Since small boys they post have separately been praised for their high intelligence and called prodigies, together they felt truly superior to everyone and everything. They discovered the work of the German philosopher Nietzsche. They believe in his idea of a Superman, an individual with extraordinary and unusual abilities that makes them above the law. Leopold is then convinced he and Loeb are so extraordinary and different rules apply to them. It took him little time to get Loeb to believe the same ideas. To test out the theory, they committed small crimes of arson and battery and got away with them all. They then decided to further push the theory. They meticulously planned the murder of Bobby Franks, Leob's second cousin and son of Chicago millionaire Jacob Franks. They typed a ransom note and opened a bank account in a fake name for the money to be deposited into. They prepared for 7 months. On May 21, 1924, they rented a car on the south side of Chicago and set out to abduct a younger boy. They roamed the streets surrounding the Harvard all-boys school for hours. Then they agreed on attacking a boy named John Levinson and watched him until they lost sight of him. Both boys assumed he went home and proceeded to conclude their day. On the way home, they ran into 14-year-old Bobby Franks, Leopold in the front driving and Loeb in the back. Loeb called out to Franks and asked if he needed a ride home. Franks shook his head no, as he was close to home. Loeb then asked about a tennis racket Franks used, claiming he wanted to get the same one for his brother. Franks walked closer to the car, and Loeb persuaded him in. Franks slid in the passenger side next to Leopold. Loeb introduced Franks to Leopold and asked if they could take him about the block. Franks denied, and as he turned to face the front of the car, Loeb grabbed a chisel and hit him in the back of the head with great force and continued to bludgeon his head. Franks was fighting for his life. He tried to turn around, use his arms to block his head, and Loeb smashed the chisel in his forehead. After all this, the boy was still alive. Loeb stuffed rags in his mouth, and finally the boy fell at his knees. The two, Leopold and Loeb, drove 25 miles to Indiana to dump the body, and on the way stopped for food and drinks with Franks's body covered in the back seat. At sunset, they arrived at a culvert and stripped the body of his clothes to be burned and poured hydrochloric acid on the face and body. During this, Leopold's glasses slipped from his pocket. Leopold carries the body in the culvert while Loeb keeps watch. On the way back to Chicago, they stop at a drugstore and Leopold calls his girlfriend stating he would be home late, thinking this would suffice for an alibi, and dropped the ransom note in the postbox. The next day, the body was found and identified. The eyeglasses left lead the police right to Leopold and Loeb. 10 days later, they confessed, both blaming the crime on each other. Leopold's father hired famous attorney Clarence Darrow. Darrow had prior history with the state's attorney Robert Crowe, and Crowe knew he was good. Darrow was able to get Leopold and Loeb out of the death penalty and got them life in prison instead. He argued nature, evolution, and Nietzsche were to blame.
Now, with the background of both the Leopold and Loeb case, as well as the Nixon case, we may ask ourselves how this relates to Native Son. During the time of writing Native Son, Richard Wright had taken inspiration from both the Robert Nixon and Leopold and Loeb case, for both cases had taken place around the 1920s and 30s in Chicago. After the publication of Native Son, Richard Wright published an essay detailing the makings of how Native Son came to be, called How Bigger Was Born. In it, he mentions how the Robert Nixon case was hot on the newspapers while he was writing the book, and he mentions, "So frequently do these acts recur that when I was halfway through the first draft of Native Son, a case paralleling Biggers flared forth in the newspapers of Chicago. Many of the newspaper items and some of the incidents in Native Son are but fictionalized versions of the Robert Nixon case and rewrites of news stories from the Chicago Tribune. There are several parallels between the case and the book, as Bigger chose to kill Bessie with a brick, Robert Nixon's infamous choice of weapon, which is shown here, the actual brick that Nixon used to kill Miss Castle. In this 1951 movie where Richard Wright, himself, stars as Bigger, two policemen find Bessie's body